April 6, 1945. Dawn over the Philippine Sea. A pale light spills across the clouds as the first formations rise from Kyushu's runways. 0 fighters stripped of armor, each carrying a 250-kilogram bomb slung beneath the fuselage. The men inside are barely 20. Some whisper prayers. Others remain silent, eyes fixed on the horizon where the enemy waits. Hundreds of miles away, the U.S. Navy's radar screens flicker to life. Operators on picket destroyers watch thin green lines crawl across circular scopes. A voice cuts through the static. Bogies inbound. Multiple contacts. Bearing southeast. Sirens wail across the decks. Gunners rush to stations. Ammunition belts clatter into place. The sea begins to tremble under the rising thunder of anti-aircraft guns. From above, the Kamikaze pilots descend through flak clouds that bloom like black flowers. To them, this is destiny, the divine wind reborn to sweep the invader from Asia. But below, an unseen force has already changed the battle. Radar and flak, precise, relentless, unyielding. The age of faith is about to meet the age of technology. By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had entered a stage that few in Tokyo dared to name: collapse. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the pride of the empire, had been shattered in the Philippine Sea that June. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot cost Japan more than 400 aircraft and nearly all of its experienced carrier pilots. The fleet that had once struck Pearl Harbor now drifted home with empty decks and hollow victories. Factories lay in ruin from American bombing. Fuel shipments from the Dutch East Indies dwindled to a trickle. Without aviation gasoline, even training flights became impossible. Yet in the corridors of the Imperial General Headquarters, a different tone prevailed, a stubborn refusal to admit defeat. One decisive blow, they insisted, and America will seek peace. It was not strategy now, but belief. That belief turned toward sacrifice. At airfields across Kyushu and Luzon, new squadrons were formed from students, reserve cadets, and volunteers barely old enough to shave. They were told their lives were weapons, that dying for the emperor would carry more weight than surviving in defeat. The program took its name from an ancient legend, Kamikaze, divine wind, recalling the typhoon that scattered Kublai Khan's Mongol invasion in the 13th century. Japan's leaders promised that spirit would rise again, a storm of human will strong enough to smash American steel. But beneath the ceremony and flags lay grim arithmetic. Every Kamikaze mission consumed an aircraft that could never be replaced. Every pilot required scarce fuel, mechanics, and logistics that Japan could scarcely supply. Still, officers on the front accepted the order. Better to burn the aircraft with purpose, one said, than watch it rust unused. By late October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the first organized Kamikaze units struck. Their results shocked the U.S. Navy. A single plane diving into the escort carrier St. Lo detonated its bomb load, sending the ship to the bottom in minutes. To Japanese observers, it looked like proof of divine favor. Newspapers proclaimed victory. Ceremonies honored the fallen as heroes reborn. For a moment, the myth seemed real. Yet American analysts saw something else. A new form of warfare, desperate but dangerous. Admiral Halsey warned that Japan had discovered a weapon no radar can stop. Crews on carriers began living under constant tension, sleeping in life jackets, eating beside anti-aircraft guns. For the first time in the war, sailors felt that death could fall from a single determined man. Tokyo seized that fear and magnified it. Propaganda films showed pilots smiling as they climbed into their cockpits, flags fluttering, drums beating. The image concealed the darker truth. Many of those young men were conscripts pressured by command or culture. Letters recovered after the war reveal hesitation, even dread. "Mother," one wrote, "I do not wish to die, but I must not shame my unit." By the winter of 1945, the Kamikaze effort had become a national movement. Priests blessed aircraft. School children folded paper cranes for the brave spirits of the sky. Factories repainted damaged planes, refitted them with minimal fuel, just enough for a one-way flight. It was the fusion of ritual and ruin, faith weaponized against inevitability. But faith alone could not bridge the technological divide. Across the Pacific, the United States had learned to fight with machines, radar, code-breaking, fire control computers, and disciplined logistics. Japanese strategists still spoke of spirit, while American engineers spoke of systems. The contrast would soon decide everything. As spring approached, the next battleground was already chosen. Okinawa, the last stepping stone before Japan itself. The Imperial General Headquarters planned to unleash more than 1,500 suicide aircraft during the invasion, striking the U.S. Fifth Fleet with every plane still capable of flight. They believed the Kamikaze could finally halt the advance and force a negotiated peace. But what they did not know was that the U.S. Navy had already built an invisible shield, one that saw beyond the horizon and turned courage into silhouettes on a radar screen. The decisive test of faith and machinery was about to begin. Across the Western Pacific, the U.S. Navy prepared for an invasion unlike any before. Operation Iceberg, the assault on Okinawa now, would require more than 1,300 ships and nearly 500,000 men. To the planners in Pearl Harbor and aboard Admiral Raymond Spruance's flagship, it was clear. Japan would throw everything it had into the defense. Radar intercepts and reconnaissance flights already hinted at swarms of aircraft assembling on Kyushu. The Fifth Fleet braced itself for waves of suicide pilots. But by 1945, the U.S. Navy had evolved into a machine built on precision and coordination. Since the early days of the war, American scientists had refined radar into a weapon of foresight. Shipborne sets like the SG and SK series could detect aircraft over 100 miles away. Destroyers were stationed in a wide ring around the main fleet. Picket ships, each acting as an early warning node. When a contact appeared on their scopes, combat information centers deep within the ship sprang to life. Voices echoed through headphones. Bearings were relayed. Interceptors were scrambled. Guns adjusted elevation and deflection by electrical signal. It was an orchestra of electronics and discipline. This network turned the ocean into something new, a battlefield of invisible lines and unseen decisions. While Japanese pilots relied on instinct and sunlight to find their targets, American operators worked through radar blips and coded reports. It was war fought in silence and in seconds, where a man staring at a green scope could decide the fate of hundreds aboard a carrier beyond the horizon. The contrast between both sides was stark. Japan's training system had disintegrated after 1943. New pilots received barely 100 hours of flight instruction, a third of what they once had. Navigation errors were common. Many kamikaze never found their targets. Others were shot down long before reaching them, lost to radar-guided interceptors like the Hellcat or Corsair. Even before their final dive, many died unseen. Meanwhile, on American decks, the anti-aircraft defenses had become layers of calculated fire. Each major ship bristled with dozens of 5-inch dual-purpose guns, directed by radar-controlled Mark 37 fire control systems. The shells they fired carried a technological marvel, the proximity fuse. Inside each was a miniature radar set, designed to detonate when it sensed a nearby aircraft. The result was devastating. A single burst could shred a kamikaze before it came within diving range. Below those guns, Bofors and Oerlikons filled the air with flak and tracers, a mechanical storm that no amount of bravery could penetrate for long. By early March 1945, the system had matured into something close to perfection. Each radar contact triggered a chain reaction. Destroyers sounding alarms, carriers launching interceptors, cruisers adjusting their fire zones. Nothing was left to chance. Discipline, repetition, and technology had become the true armor of the fleet. Yet even with these defenses, the kamikaze still frightened the men who faced them. No amount of radar training could erase the image of a burning plane aimed directly at the bridge. Sailors spoke in hushed tones about the pilot's willingness to die. Some felt pity, others rage. You couldn't reason with them, one gunner said. They just kept coming. The psychological weight of that persistence haunted every watch and every night at sea. Commanders understood that radar could detect, but not prevent, the horror that followed. Every hit that slipped through meant dozens dead, fire on deck, ammunition exploding. The fleet's defense was a race against both physics and faith. Could machines react faster than a man ready to die? In Tokyo, the high command still believed the answer was no. Reports from Leyte were exaggerated into victory stories. The emperor was told that suicide attacks had sunk entire American fleets. Few dared to speak of the truth, that the United States was adapting, learning, and tightening its defenses with each encounter. By late March, as the invasion of Okinawa loomed, Japan assembled what it called the Kyushu, floating chrysanthemum waves. Each would launch hundreds of kamikaze aircraft in coordinated strikes, supported by conventional bombers and fighters. On paper, it seemed unstoppable. In reality, it would become a test of human resolve against mechanical precision. And as the first wave took flight on that pale April morning, the sky above Okinawa filled with echoes of both worlds, the fading roar of a dying empire, and the cold hum of radar that would soon render its sacrifice invisible. The stage was set. The battle for Okinawa was about to reveal whether faith could still bend steel, or whether steel, guided by reason, would finally end faith's illusion. They called them Tokotai, special attack units. But to the men inside the cockpits, the title carried more burden than honor. In the training fields of Kyushu and Formosa, the final days of Japan's air arm were written in silence. Rows of young pilots stood before photographs of the emperor, heads bowed, awaiting speeches that blurred duty and death. Instructors told them that their sacrifice would save the nation, that one body, one plane, one strike could alter the course of the war. Some wept quietly, others stared straight ahead, refusing to betray fear. Most were boys, university students pulled from classrooms, farmhands drafted with barely a month of flight instruction. Many had never fired a gun in combat. Before each mission, they wrote farewell letters, some confident, some trembling. "I go now with joy," one wrote. "May my small life protect the homeland." Another simply wrote, "Forgive me." At night, the airfields glowed under dim lanterns as mechanics worked to prepare the aircraft. Each plane carried a fragment of humanity, a silk headband with the rising sun, a poem taped to the dashboard, a final photograph tucked into a pocket. The ceremonies before takeoff were deliberate and slow. A drink of sake, a bow, the promise of reunion in the afterlife. Then the engines coughed to life and the sound of hundreds of propellers drowned everything else. From a distance it seemed noble, but close up it was exhaustion disguised as honor. Many commanders knew these missions would achieve little beyond spectacle. Yet they also understood something deeper, that Japan's war machine no longer had the means to fight conventionally. The kamikaze was not only a tactic, it was a confession. Behind each suicide flight was careful, almost mechanical planning. The myth of divine chaos hid a network of coordination that stretched from Tokyo to the coast of Kyushu. Intelligence officers studied U.S. fleet movements, radar coverage, and patrol zones. Weather stations tracked wind and cloud cover, hoping to find conditions that would hide the approaching aircraft. Operations were divided into waves, each assigned to approach from different bearings to confuse radar and overwhelm defenses. Some pilots were ordered to fly low over the water, invisible to radar until the final climb. Others rose high into the clouds to dive vertically from the sun. The aim was simple: force the enemy's radar screens to flood with so many contacts that no one could tell which were real. Each wave also included decoys, conventional fighters meant to draw off interceptors or suppress anti-aircraft guns. The kamikaze pilots were told to watch for carrier decks, island airstrips, and battleship bridges, anything that would burn or explode dramatically. They were instructed to hit fuel stores, elevators, or flight decks to maximize chaos. On paper, it resembled strategy. In practice, it was tragedy in formation. Most pilots lacked navigational experience. Once airborne, radio silence and primitive instruments left them adrift. U.S. radar networks spotted them long before they came within range. Fighter direction officers aboard carriers vectored interceptors to the threat lines, while destroyers tracked altitude and speed. The Japanese formation scattered under attack, leaving lone planes to wander the sky. Some crashed into the ocean without ever seeing a ship. The tactical plan relied on faith that enough men would break through to justify the losses. By the spring of 1945, that faith had consumed almost everything else. When the kamikaze were first conceived, Japan's technological foundation was already eroding. Radar research had begun before the war, but production never matched the Allies. By 1945, Japan fielded only a handful of primitive air warning sets with limited range and poor reliability. Most coastal bases relied on visual spotters and sound detectors, men listening for engines in the dark. Communication between bases and aircraft was equally fragile. Radios were weak and easily jammed. Pilots often lost contact minutes after takeoff. Fuel shortages made practice impossible. Engine failures were frequent. The famed Mitsubishi Zero, once unmatched in agility, was now outclassed and outdated. Its light frame, once an advantage, turned it into tinder against radar-guided flak. Desperation drove innovation, but too late. Engineers proposed rocket-assisted gliders, human torpedoes, and the Oka, a piloted bomb with rocket propulsion that could reach nearly 600 miles per hour. Yet launching it required a cumbersome mother plane, usually shot down before release. For every new idea, there was a shortage of metal, fuel, or time. What Japan built instead was myth, the illusion that courage could replace circuitry. Speeches in Tokyo spoke of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of the warrior, as a force greater than machinery. But in reality, every sortie was a race against mathematics. One plane, one pilot, one chance against a fleet protected by hundreds of guns and the silent reach of radar. To the men on the ground, it was invisible, but to the men at sea, it was destiny taking shape on a glowing green screen. And as those screens began to light up in early April 1945, the contrast between belief and technology was no longer theoretical. It was about to be measured in fire, in smoke, and in the number of planes that would never return. While the Japanese pinned their hopes on divine wind, the Americans placed theirs on invisible waves of energy. Radar, that quiet, flickering guardian, had matured into a battlefield intellect. Destroyers stationed far ahead of the main fleet acted as radar pickets, each an isolated sentinel facing the oncoming storm. Their task was suicidal in its own way: to detect enemy aircraft early, relay positions, and draw the first attacks away from the carriers. These picket ships bore the full fury of the Kamikaze. On their decks, radar screens glowed in the dim light of combat information centers. Sailors stared at thin arcs sweeping through circles of static. Each new blip meant death approaching at hundreds of miles per hour. Commands rippled instantly through radio channels. Fighter Director to Capi, Vector 120, Angels 5. Corsairs and Hellcats roared off carrier decks, guided entirely by voice and coordinates. In a single seamless system, radar, aircraft, and flak worked together as a mechanical organism. Cold, precise, tireless. Then came the sound. The thunder of 5-inch guns, the rhythmic hammering of Bofors, the shrill chatter of Oerlikons. Tracers wove a burning net across the sky. Proximity-fused shells burst near their targets, showering fragments that tore through aluminum wings. Radar-assisted directors tracked altitude and speed, calculating in seconds what human eyes once needed minutes to judge. To the Japanese pilots, it must have looked like chaos, a sea of flame, a sky filled with fire. But beneath that chaos lay pure calculation. Each American ship was now part of a coordinated matrix of detection and destruction. Nothing in history had ever combined human reflex and electronic logic so completely. In the end, the battle would not be decided by courage alone, but by which side could process fear faster than it arrived. Two men, thousands of miles apart, embodied the extremes of this struggle. On one side stood Vice Admiral Motomi Ugaki, commander of Japan's 5th Air Fleet, a man devoted to the ideal of honorable death. To him, the Kamikaze represented purity, untainted by fear or hesitation. He believed that the spirit of sacrifice could compensate for material inferiority. Ugaki coordinated massive suicide waves against the U.S. fleet at Okinawa, sending thousands of young pilots to die believing their deaths would shake American morale. Ugaki himself would later die in the same fashion, flying his own suicide mission after Japan's surrender, convinced his death would preserve dignity amid defeat. Opposite him, aboard the flagships of the 5th Fleet, stood Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, calm, methodical, almost expressionless. Spruance's philosophy was the inverse of Ugaki's. War was not about glory but about results. His doctrine of calculated patience defined the American advance, steady, coordinated, and mercilessly efficient. He trusted his subordinates, his systems, and above all, his data. Where Ugaki prayed for miracles, Spruance built certainty. Under his command, radar picket stations, carrier task groups, and fire control networks operated as extensions of reason itself. There was no room for heroism, only performance. Each ship, each gun, each man was a gear in a machine designed to survive. Between these two men stretched the vast philosophical gulf that defined the Pacific War. Faith versus system, destiny versus design. And in the skies over Okinawa, their beliefs would finally collide. Even among the victors, there was unease. When the Kamikaze attacks began, American sailors felt rage, a raw personal hatred for an enemy that refused surrender. But as the weeks went on, something shifted. Survivors from burning ships often saw fragments of the enemy, a charred uniform, a photo drifting in the water, a diary recovered from wreckage. It became harder to hate the dead. "I used to cheer when we hit one," a destroyer gunner later said. "Then I realized there was a boy in that plane, maybe just doing what he was told." That realization spread quietly through the fleet. The Kamikaze were not demons. They were men trapped in a collapsing system, driven by orders they could not question and faith they could not escape. The U.S. Navy, despite its victory, carried the psychological toll. Crews lived under constant alert, never sure if the next blip on radar would bring their death. For every kamikaze that reached a ship, dozens of sailors died in seconds. Fire, shrapnel, fuel explosions. Some men never spoke of those moments again. Others developed a deep respect for the enemy's commitment, even as they condemned its futility. On the Japanese side, the moral paradox was unbearable. Survivors, ground crews, instructors, commanders, lived with the knowledge that they had sent their own students, brothers, and friends to certain death. Few believed, even then, that the kamikaze could truly change the outcome. But to resist was treason. To question was shame. So they watched in silence as the planes took off, engines roaring into the dawn, each sound a farewell. War, in its purest form, had reduced both sides to reflection. For Japan, the kamikaze was the final expression of faith without foresight. For America, radar and flak became symbols of a new kind of warfare, impersonal, mechanical, yet devastatingly effective. Between them lay the truth of modern conflict, that courage could not survive without comprehension. And as the last waves formed over Kyushu in April 1945, both nations were about to discover that no belief, however strong, could outfly the reach of science. April 6, 1945, dawn over Kyushu. The largest kamikaze force ever assembled prepares to take flight. It is called Kyushu, the floating chrysanthemum. More than 350 suicide planes and 300 conventional escorts crowd the runways. Mechanics wave flags. Priests chant final blessings. Commanders shout encouragements no one can hear over the roar of engines. At 10:30 a.m., the first wave rises into the cold morning air, bound for the American fleet off Okinawa, 600 kilometers away. Each pilot carries enough fuel for a single journey. Their orders are simple: strike anything that floats. Far to the south, the U.S. radar picket line is already alive. Destroyers like the Bush, Colhoun, Cassini-Young, and Pickens stand dozens of miles ahead of the main fleet, small silhouettes in an ocean of gray. On their decks, radar scopes pulse, operators hunched over glowing screens. At 12:08 p.m., faint contacts appear, hundreds of them approaching from the north. The calm of the sea vanishes. Air raid, bearing 020, distance 70 miles. Sirens wail. Gunners run to their stations. Ammunition belts clatter. Engines rumble as carriers begin evasive turns. Overhead, Corsairs and Hellcats scramble to intercept, their propellers slicing through the humid air. By 1 p.m., the sky above the radar pickets turns into a furnace. The destroyer Bush is the first to be hit. 3 kamikaze crash through her decks in rapid succession, detonating bombs that rip the ship in half. Flames engulf the forward section. Survivors jump into burning oil slicks as ammunition cooks off behind them. Within minutes, the ship disappears beneath the sea. Nearby, Colhoun fights for her life. Her gunners fire until their barrels glow red, bringing down 4 attackers before 2 more slam into her amidships. The explosion throws men into the air. The ship lists heavily, burning from bow to stern. Abandon ship, comes the final order. She sinks an hour later. From the flagship Bunker Hill, radar operators track the chaos. Blips multiply faster than voices can report them. Where's the combat? Information center becomes a blur of calls and coordinates, a human brain racing against the oncoming tide. Admiral Spruance's Fifth Fleet braces for impact. Around 2:30 p.m., the Kamikaze break through the outer defenses. They dive at carriers, destroyers, transports, anything within sight. The air fills with tracers, smoke, and the roar of anti-aircraft fire. From a distance it looks like a storm of metal. From below it feels like the end of the world. The carrier Hancock takes a direct hit. The plane's bomb detonates on her flight deck, killing 62 men and setting fuel fires that rage for hours. The Mayo, Stanley, Newcomb, and Mulaney are all struck in quick succession. Even ships that survive are left scarred, decks torn, turrets bent, men burned beyond recognition. One U.S. officer later wrote, "They came in waves, and there was no pattern, no hesitation, no mercy, just fire from the sky." By nightfall, over 350 Japanese aircraft have attacked the fleet. More than 30 American ships are sunk or damaged, with nearly 500 men killed and hundreds wounded. It is the single largest coordinated suicide assault in history. And yet, it is only the beginning. That same evening, new radar contacts appear. The second wave, Kyushu 2, forming for the next morning. But beneath the horror, the U.S. defense is already adapting. Radar operators begin tracking not just altitude but formation speed, allowing fighter directors to vector interceptors earlier. The Navy's anti-aircraft network learns within hours to anticipate approach patterns and adjust fire zones dynamically. What begins as chaos starts to harden into a system, one that will soon turn the tide. For now, though, the cost is staggering. The sea is littered with debris, oil, and bodies. Survivors are pulled aboard rescue ships in silence. Smoke rises into a sky darkened by the scent of burned fuel and salt. In the distance over the radio, a calm voice repeats the only words that matter. "More incoming. Bearing 030. Range 90 miles. The radar screens never go dark. And as April gives way to May, the Kamikaze waves will keep coming. 10 major attacks in all, each smaller, each more desperate than the last. But within those weeks, a shift occurs. The Americans no longer fight in panic. They fight in rhythm. Radar's rhythm, flak's rhythm, precision's rhythm. The divine wind has met the age of data, and the wind is beginning to falter. April bled into May, and still the sky burned. Each morning, radar picket destroyers. Watch their scopes bloom with contacts, first a handful, then dozens. The calls became routine. Raid inbound, altitude 2000, speed 150 knots. The men no longer flinched. They had learned the rhythm of the Kamikaze. But this time, the Americans were ready. Between April 12th and May 28th, Japan launched 9 more massive suicide assaults, each named Kyushu after the imperial chrysanthemum. In total, over 1,900 kamikaze aircraft hurled themselves at the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Yet for every one that struck, more than 4 were shot down before reaching their target. The mechanical precision that had once seemed cold now became the fleet's salvation. Radar stations on destroyers detected approaching raids up to 120 miles out. Fighter direction officers aboard carriers coordinated with pickets in real time, vectoring Corsairs and Hellcats toward incoming formations. The sky became a vast grid of data, altitudes, bearings, velocities, fed into a symphony of coordination that no human instinct could match. The Japanese pilots never saw this system. They saw only the flashes, white bursts in the distance that grew larger until they filled the sky. Proximity-fused shells exploded in near-perfect spheres. Each detonation shredded the air, turning courage into fragments of metal and fire. To the men below, it was a spectacle of death. The sky rained debris and fuel. Some kamikaze broke formation and dove early, desperate to find something, anything, before being torn apart. But the U.S. flak zones were now layered and overlapping. Even if one pilot slipped through the radar screen, the wall of gunfire waiting at the fleet's perimeter rarely missed. May 11th, 1945, the turning point. The carrier USS Bunker Hill, one of the fleet's most powerful flagships, becomes a symbol of both the kamikaze's last fury and its ultimate futility. Two Zeros break through cloud cover almost undetected, diving steeply toward her deck. The first crashes near the island's superstructure, its bomb detonating among fully fueled aircraft. Seconds later, the second hits nearly the same spot. The explosions rip the flight deck apart. Aviation fuel ignites. In minutes, the entire ship becomes an inferno. Nearly 400 men are killed, 264 wounded. The fire burns for 8 hours. And yet, Bunker Hill does not sink. Her damage control, teams drilled beyond exhaustion, seal compartments, flood magazines, and fight the flames until the ship stabilizes. She will survive and return home for repairs. The Kamikaze had struck with precision and courage. But against the industrial strength of an enemy that could absorb disaster and continue fighting, even success brought no victory. After that day, the waves began to thin. Japan's airfields were craters, its fuel reserves nearly gone. Pilots took off in planes patched with scrap aluminum and engines that coughed smoke on takeoff. American carriers rotated radar coverage and fighter patrols seamlessly. Destroyers formed mobile picket teams that shifted by the hour. The fleet's learning curve rose faster than Japan's capacity to sustain attacks. By late May, surviving Kamikaze often flew alone. They launched from hidden airstrips, guided by rumor rather than command. Some never found the fleet at all. They crashed into the sea, lost to exhaustion or faulty bearings. Others, chased by interceptors, simply vanished into clouds, erased from both radar and history. On May 25th, the 10th Kyushu attack sputtered into existence. Barely 50 aircraft reached the ocean. Few came close to the fleet. The once feared waves were now scattered drops of a broken storm. When the radar screens went quiet that night, a strange silence settled across the task forces. For the first time in weeks, no new blips appeared. The operators waited, listening to static. None came. The divine wind had spent itself against the walls of steel and circuitry. In Tokyo, reports grew grim. The Fifth Air Fleet's strength was gone. Out of more than 4,000 aircraft launched since October, fewer than 500 remained. Pilots were gone, fuel gone, and with them the illusion that sacrifice could substitute for science. Admiral Ugaki, reading the final reports, wrote in his diary, "If we continue thus, the skies will be empty. Our hope has melted into the sea." Yet Japan did continue, not from hope but from habit. The Kamikaze had become not a tactic but a symbol, one the nation could no longer sustain yet dared not abandon. Even as Okinawa fell, planners spoke of waves of suicide planes for the eventual defense of Kyushu. Millions of civilians were being trained with bamboo spears for an invasion that would never come. In the eyes of the world, the Kamikaze's fury ended at Okinawa, but in the hearts of those who survived, its echo lingered, a testament to both the power and the peril of faith untempered by reason. By June 1945, the U.S. Navy controlled the sea around Okinawa. Radar watch continued day and night, but the skies stayed empty. The men at the scopes began to realize that the silence meant more than victory. It meant the enemy had finally run out of believers. When the last Kamikaze raid faded from radar in June 1945, the silence felt unnatural. For weeks, men on the U.S. picket ships had lived by sound. The wail of sirens, the roar of engines, the thunder of flak. Now the sea was calm, broken only by the drone of patrol aircraft circling above. The operators leaned back from their scopes, eyes red from sleepless nights, and realized the war in the air over Okinawa was finally over. But the price was staggering. During the campaign, more than 1,900 Kamikaze aircraft had been launched. They sank over 30 U.S. ships and damaged more than 350. Nearly 5,000 American sailors were killed, the single deadliest naval battle in the Pacific. The radar picket destroyers, stationed far from the fleet to provide early warning, bore the brunt of the attacks. Ships like USS Bush, USS Laffey, and USS Little became floating testaments to endurance and destruction. On April 16th alone, USS Laffey was struck by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs within minutes. Her decks were soaked in aviation fuel. Her gun crews half dead, yet she refused to sink. When the smoke cleared, her captain radioed, "We're still here. My engines are running, my guns are firing, and I can fight." Such resilience defined the American fleet. A network of ships that could absorb punishment no other navy could withstand. But it came at immense human cost. Entire crews were burned, blinded, or swept into the sea. Survivors spoke later of the smell of cordite, gasoline, and flesh, a scent that clung to the metal for days. Across the water, Japan's air bases told a different story, one of silence, exhaustion, and futility. By June, the once proud airfields at Kanoya, Chiran, and Kushira were graveyards of twisted fuselages. Mechanics stripped parts from wrecks to keep a few planes flying. Aviation fuel was so scarce that new kamikaze pilots practiced taxiing instead of flying. The Fifth Air Fleet, which had sworn to crush the American invasion through divine sacrifice, was no longer an air force. It was a name and a memory. Yet even as the nation starved, Tokyo continued to issue orders for suicide defense. Government propaganda still promised that the next wind would destroy the enemy. But among the surviving pilots and ground crews, belief had begun to crumble. They had seen what radar and flak could do. They had watched entire waves vanish into the sea without touching a single ship. Some officers whispered that the war was already lost, not on the ground but in the air, where technology had finally overpowered courage. Japan's industrial heart could not compete with the American machine that produced carriers faster than Japan could destroy them. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, learned hard lessons from Okinawa. Radar coordination, once experimental, was now doctrine. Destroyer pickets became integrated air defense hubs, supported by combat air patrols and radar intercept controllers. Every major carrier strike group adopted the system. The fleet had transformed into a living organism, one that could see beyond the horizon and strike before the enemy even appeared. To American commanders, the Kamikaze campaign confirmed the grim necessity of their next steps. If Japan would not surrender, invasion would mean annihilation on both sides. Plans for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Kyushu, assumed hundreds of thousands of Japanese suicide aircraft and boats. Every calculation showed staggering losses. The very success of radar and flak had bought the Navy time but not immunity. And while the fleet recovered, Okinawa itself became the new face of hell. Civilians hid in caves. Japanese soldiers fought to the last man. By the end of June, over 100,000 Japanese troops and 75,000 civilians lay dead. The island was secured, but the victory felt hollow. Another step closer to a mainland invasion that promised worse. In Washington and Guam, commanders studied the kamikaze reports in silence. The data was clear. Japan had exhausted its air power. The divine wind had failed. Yet it had also revealed something deeper, the willingness of an entire nation to die rather than yield. It was a warning of what awaited on the home islands. That warning would shape the most consequential decision in military history, one not of air or sea, but of atomic fire. By the end of July 1945, Japan's sky had become a void. Radar stations along Kyushu stood in eerie silence, their screens blank except for the static of a dying war. The men who once guided kamikaze pilots to glory now stared at empty airfields. The fuel drums were dry, the hangars hollow, the banners of the divine wind flapping over ruins. In Tokyo, the Fifth Air Fleet's headquarters compiled its final report. The numbers were brutal. Over 4,000 aircraft lost, more than 3,800 pilots killed, and the U.S. Navy's operational strength, despite catastrophic hits, remained intact. The kamikaze strategy, once hailed as Japan's final weapon of faith, had become its final wound. The Japanese High Command had misjudged not the courage of their men, but the nature of modern war. In an age ruled by radar, radio, and industrial production, belief alone could not penetrate the invisible wall of detection that now guarded every American fleet. Each kamikaze flight that took off was tracked, intercepted, and obliterated before it even glimpsed the target it sought to die for. In the surviving diaries of kamikaze pilots, one can read the slow disillusionment that followed. A 20-year-old ensign named Taro Nakajima wrote shortly before his final mission, "We are told we will strike like thunder, but the Americans always know. Their fire waits before we arrive. Perhaps the gods favor those who prepare." It was not a rebellion, merely a quiet recognition that courage without comprehension was suicide without purpose. Many among Japan's young airmen began to understand that they were dying not to defend their homeland, but to delay the inevitable. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, that realization became complete. The divine wind that had once been a symbol of divine protection was replaced by an entirely new force, invisible, unstoppable, born of science. Within days, the Emperor's voice broke through the radio silence announcing surrender. For many survivors of the Kamikaze Corps, it was the first time they had ever heard him speak. Japan's defeat did not erase the Kamikaze, it immortalized it. In the years after the war, as Japan rebuilt from ashes, the memory of those pilots became a subject of quiet mourning and complex pride. Families placed photographs of their sons in small shrines. Government officials avoided the word suicide, preferring tokotai, special attack units. It was not glorified nor entirely condemned. It was a wound the nation learned to live with. For the U.S. Navy, the Kamikaze experience reshaped naval warfare forever. The radar picket system that saved the fleet became the model for integrated air defense in the Cold War. Anti-aircraft coordination evolved into guided missile defense. Every carrier group that sailed after 1945 carried the lessons of Okinawa, that survival depended not only on firepower, but on foresight. And yet, among sailors who served in those waters, the memory of the Kamikaze never faded. Many later said that no weapon inspired such conflicting emotions: hatred for its destruction, pity for its pilots, and awe for the resolve that drove them. Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison, the Navy's official historian, wrote, "They were the bravest of enemies, and the most tragic. Theirs was the courage of despair, not of hope." In post-war Japan, survivors of the Kamikaze training units rarely spoke of their service. Some became teachers, farmers, or engineers. Others never escaped the shadow of what they were prepared to do. One pilot, interviewed decades later, said softly, "We were told our bodies were bullets, but even a bullet can feel fear before it flies." The legacy of the Kamikaze campaign is not just one of loss, but of revelation, that technology had forever altered the nature of sacrifice. Radar and flak had not merely defeated Japan's suicide planes, they had demonstrated a new kind of warfare where machines decided moments faster than men, where courage could no longer close the gap between faith and fact. As Japan surrendered, the Pacific grew still again. The war that had begun with surprise, Pearl Harbor, ended with prediction, the ability to see death coming long before it arrived. In that silence between radar pulses and fading echoes, a new world was being born, one where courage would no longer be enough, and survival would belong to those who could see first. In the end, the story of the Kamikaze is not simply about death, it is about the collision between two ages. One built on faith, ritual, and sacrifice, the other on reason, science, and machinery. When those two worlds met above the waters of Okinawa, the outcome was not decided by courage but by calculation. The Japanese pilots who climbed into their cockpits believed they were flying into eternity. Their commanders told them that one perfect strike could change the war, that devotion could overpower steel. But the radar screens told another truth, one that pulsed in green light across the dark sea. It showed that no matter how fierce the will, it could not overcome a system that could see, track, and strike before the human eye could even react. That realization reshaped the world. It signaled the death of the warrior age and the rise of the technological one. Warfare was no longer defined by bravery but by information. Who detected first, who fired first, who learned faster. From those early radar screens would come guided missiles, jet interceptors, and digital networks that turned the battlefield into mathematics. And yet within that progress lies a quiet sorrow. Because even as machines grew stronger, the courage of men like those Kamikaze pilots became harder to comprehend and easier to forget. Their story remains both tragedy and warning, that blind faith, no matter how noble, cannot substitute for understanding, and that technology, no matter how advanced, cannot cleanse the cost of war. The divine wind that once promised salvation instead carried Japan into ruin, but its echo endures, whispering through every radar pulse and electronic hum of the modern age. It reminds us that war is not just fought with weapons but with belief, and that when belief meets technology, history turns.